talk about reasoning by analogy. Okay. When you reason by analogy, you take an analogy and you use the analogy to demonstrate the validity or invalidity of an argument. All right. And an analogy is just a comparison between two objects or systems or something that highlights their similarities. No analogy is a perfect representation of the thing it's analogizing. Is that a word? I don't know. Anyway, it's not perfect. Okay. So if you're reasoning by analogy, you're admitting that you're losing something in the transfer from the thing that you're discussing to the analogy. But you're using the analogy because it's easier to talk about the analogy. Maybe it's a little less complicated than the actual thing that you're talking about. Here's how it's structured. So a premise A is similar to B in some known respects. There's another premise which is B has characteristic X. And the conclusion would be then A probably has characteristic X. Here's this thing. Here's this other thing that's like it. This other thing that's like it has this characteristic. So the original thing probably has that characteristic as well. That's the idea of reasoning by analogy. Here's some examples. The brain is the hardware and our consciousness and is the software that runs on the hardware. Okay, so that's one analogy. To imagine one dimension, imagine a worm on a wire that can only move forward and backward. Okay, so that's one way that we can imagine one direction. Obviously, it's not 100% true, right? Because a worm is a three-dimensional object, right? And so, but this analogy helps us imagine what it would be like in one direction if you were a worm on a wire and you can only move back and forth, or forward and backward. Okay, that's what one dimension would be like, right? Life is like, there's plenty of analogies like life is like climbing a mountain, a box of chocolates, and the more useful the analogies are, the more you try to extrapolate from those. You can think of another analogy here. You can think of the atmosphere like a blanket around the earth. Obviously, it's not a literal blanket. Obviously, it's wrong for a number of reasons, but it might be right in certain respects, and especially if you're trying to convey an idea to somebody that's not familiar with the technical jargon around, what an atmosphere is or whatever. You can help them understand it better by using an analogy. Okay. If you want to counter reasoning by analogy, here's a few ways that you can do it. This I took from the philosopher Peter Singer. You can attack the similarities. So you can show that the similarities between them they're not relevant. They're not philosophically significant. And so you can just go right at the similarities. It's kind of the direct tact. Okay. You can show that there are relevant differences which may have not been considered. So in other words, your analogy is not good enough. Okay. So the analogy that you've built has too many flaws in it. It's too dissimilar to the thing that you're actually discussing for it to be useful or for you to make the argument that you're trying to make. It cancels out the similarities between the cases. You can also dispute the uncontroversial nature of the first case. So this idea would be like, maybe we should import our uncertain conclusion, the analogous conclusion, and maybe we should insert that into X, which is the original argument. Okay, that's it for reasoning by analogy. Reasoning by analogy has its flaws, there's no question, but I found that it can be really useful when you're trying to make an argument with someone and you're not connecting in, what would you say, at the base level of the discussion. You're not connecting there, so you try to take it to a different level. Maybe it's a simplified version of it, but at least it distills it down to something that's easier to discuss. So a really useful tool, trying to come up with an analogy for a situation to make your case, right? Counterfactual, last thing we're going to talk about. There's not a lot of creativity here, but a counterfactual is just really important to think about when you're having a discussion with someone. So a counterfactual is just what would have occurred if some event had not occurred. So here's some examples. Donald Trump was elected president. The counterfactual would be Hillary Clinton was elected president. That'd be the counterfactual. And so you might hear arguments that are like, well, Donald Trump was elected and this bad thing happened. And the question is, well, the counterfactual would be, if Hillary Clinton was elected, would there have been other bad things that would have happened that would have been worse than had it not? And so, we'll get to the problems with counterfactuals in a second, but you can already probably sense them coming. This morning you arrived to school on time. The counterfactual situation is, what if you would have arrived late? Okay, we took this route and we're in a car accident. If we'd taken a different route, we wouldn't have. It's like, maybe. You don't know, right? The counterfactual is that you take the different route and then presumably avoid the car accident. If I would have dated someone else, things would have turned out better. Classic counterfactual example there. Now, let's talk about their utilities before we talk about their limitations. So often counterfactuals are necessary to consider in an argument. So if X happened instead of Y, the world would be like this. And so you have to, these are critical pieces to a number of arguments, right? If you're going to argue something would have been better had this thing not happened, you're automatically talking about counterfactuals. The problem with them that is obvious, and you've probably already figured out, is that you can't run the counterfactual, right? In a lot of situations. So in terms of presidential elections, we can't have a situation in which Donald Trump has been elected and a situation in which Hillary Clinton has been elected, and then run those two experiments simultaneously and find out which one would have worked out better, and by which metrics. We just can't run them. Okay, so a lot of it's hypothetical. You can rely on history to some extent to give you an idea of what would happen in certain situations. That's obviously not always ideal or perfect. Okay, how do I recommend using it? Well, you might use it in situations in which the counterfactual is not being considered at all. So if you hear an argument like this, the Industrial Revolution has been terrible for humanity. We've been destroying the planet, and it all traces back to the Industrial Revolution. So let's say that basically you can be in agreement, right? That pollution is much worse than it is now. There's much more pollution. There's lots of different types of pollution. We don't know how bad the extent to which pollution is going to harm us. Global warming could be a catastrophic situation that was kind of ignited by the Industrial Revolution. Okay. However, the counterfactual to that would be, what if we had not had the Industrial Revolution? Where would we be as a society? And there's a compelling argument probably to be made that despite the problems, the environmental problems, right, with the Industrial Revolution, we might be better off on the whole, on the average, than had we not taken that tack. It's up for debate. But lots of times the counterfactual in that situation is not considered. Or here's another one. The New Deal had long-lasting negative results. Social Security doesn't solve it now and continues to get worse. There's all these, there's problems with that we can't fund these programs. The counterfactual is that had the New Deal not been passed, it's like, what would have happened in that situation? And so you need to consider that. You need to consider that seriously if you're going to make this argument, just like the previous bullet point. Right? But you need to consider the counterfactual in order to make a compelling case. All right? And that's it for creativity and reasoning. So hopefully you found something there in those lessons that'll help you kind of elevate your argument game, your reasoning game to another level.